welcome to Inside. Why Inside? Because I want to understand why we have been so obsessed with the vector, the drive to be always outside, which makes the landing, coming down to earth, so difficult to understand. I'm French, I give lectures in 3 parts, as usual, so my lecture is in 3 parts. The first part will be trying to understand this obsession for the outsiderness and the drive toward the outside. The second part will be more tentative, trying to find alternative representation, so to speak, of this inside, and explore some of the reason why it's so difficult to understand where we are. And the third one will be a sort of political conclusion, why this impossibility, in a way, to be inside has political consequences which have been there all along, but today become fairly tragic. Now, I will give a lecture, but because of a scenography invented by Frédérique Ait-Touati, and with the image of Alexandra Arène and Axel Grégoire and Sonia Levy, you are supposed to see a performance, but I give a lecture. So let me start with an anecdote. I was in the plane going to Calgary a few years back, and as you know, when you are in a plane, the steward always wants you to see nothing. They always ask you to close the shutters, I think it's called. And of course, I always complain, and I lift my shutter. I was on top of a land of Baffin, at the end of the Arctic. And this is what I saw. I don't know if you see it very well, but the ice pack basically was screaming at me. And the shape of this ice pack was very disturbing. It looks like, if you see it well, the scream of Munch, basically. I know it's a projection of mine. I don't say, strictly speaking, that the ice pack spoke to me. But I've done this trip many times, and every time, in the old days, when I was young, I was inspired, as many of you, I'm sure, by the feeling of a sublime, the traditional beauty of seeing this marvelous landscape. But of course now, the landscape is there, but the sublime has completely disappeared. Because I know, and we all know, that the very fact of being in that plane on top of the land of Baffin was actually minuscule, but a sizable consequence on precisely this ice pack disappearing, as you know, earlier and earlier every day. And the second aspect of the sublime is that you're supposed to feel it, not only that you have to be outside, but also that you have to feel superior, so to speak. Not superior in size, you're supposed to be very diminutive in size, compared to the immensity of the glaciers, immensity of the ocean, immensity of the ice pack, but superior in the soul. So the sublime requires these 2 elements. I'm outside, I'm not concerned by what I see, this is why it's so beautiful, and I am small in terms of my size, but of course much bigger in terms of my soul and consciousness to what I see. But of course this is no longer the case, because we don't feel extremely big and conscious and have a great soul when you realize that this trip, added to the thousands and millions of other trips, do have an influence on what we actually see in the landscape. So the very notion of landscape, in a way, I think has largely disappeared. That's one of the meaning of being inside. We are no longer the capacity of seeing anything from the outside if the landscape that you look at is actually what you are transforming by looking at it in some sort of sense. So the insidedness is one of these elements I'd like to explore with you in this lecture. But the first thing I need in order for you to feel this insidedness, it is why it's so wrong with the idea of a cave inside which we reside. Why is it so difficult to be inside a cave? And of course, you will not be surprised, I'm a bit of a philosopher, and we all know the myth. The myth is the myth of a cave. You hear the cave? Here it is. Plato's cave, of course. What is funny in this, funny is not the word, what is beautiful and funny in this myth is that you are supposed to be prisoners, like you are here. You are not supposed to look at each other. As you know, you have binders, so you only and you are, of course, in chains. So you are not allowed to move. It's a very strange situation. And what you see on the screen is the only thing you have to make sense of a word, as you know. And you know the story, of course. The philosopher gets out, converts, go outside, and see the sun, is blinded by the sun at first, and then accommodate his vision, and it ends up badly. He comes back, and the silly prisoners, obscurantist and in chain, kills him. What I've always been surprised by this myth is the complete implausibility of the situation. Because you are not allowed to talk to one another, you are not allowed to move, to test any hypothesis with your neighbors, not to touch anything of what you see on the screen, not to turn around and make experiment on any of the elements that you are supposed to be interested in and which are projected on the screen. And for many years I've wondered, why is it so strange and so unlikely that this absolutely central and basic myth for the notion of outsiderness, which is one of the drive to get out and finally get at the truth, be so bizarre in its makeup. And I think I found the solution when I realized that, of course, the myth of a cave is a show. It's a show. It's not a real. Look, you see the upload? It's very obvious that it's a show. It's not a myth that we have to take seriously. It's a play which has been played, probably in Athens, and which has, of course, amused enormously all the people there. And the people applaud not to the plausibility of a situation, which is completely ridiculous, with the people, prisoners, not allowed to speak to one another, but people have applauded to the irony or bizarre features of these implausible philosophers, imagining that it converts, gets out, comes back, and is put to death. It's a bit like Aristophanes' the clouds, if you want. So that is a complete myth, but a beautiful scene. So we should admire the show, but of course not believe a word of the fact that it would be the driving force and the driving vector that should organize all our relation with what is inside, as if insiderness was the cave and the only project was to move out in order to get the truth. So if it's a show, it's a beautiful show. If it's a truth about what it is to direct our existence, it's of course a very implausible absurdity. But the problem is that it's the source of that's what I would argue in this lecture, of a complete disinterest in the possibility of living on Earth. So it's not just an innocent confusion between the myth and the show. It's actually what organizes our disinterest or indifference to the Earth. But there's another reason why we have so much difficulty in understanding the connection with the inside. We are looking at the blue planet. It is beautiful, I recognize. It's a beautiful image. But why is it on every ecological tract, books, and every kid's booklet, every time you hear something about people talking about ecology, nature of the planet, they show this image? And I think there is something very disturbing in this image, even though it looks like the obligatory icon of the Earth. And the reason is simple, is that it's from the outside. If you are possibly looking at this image, it means you are outside, you are somewhere in space. I mean, you might be in a space shuttle, but certainly there are very few people in those space shuttles. So when you consider the globe, you consider, in fact, something which is viewed with far, very far, and in fact, a view from nowhere. So that's why I'm interested in this insiderness. The canonical image, to understand the planet, the canonical image, which is played and replayed and replayed every time people talk about the planet, is actually something which is a view from literally nowhere. And the worst of it is that the globe is, of course, fitting exactly in many other images and myths which are much more ancient. Of course, the globe of the cartographer from the 16th century onward, but much older, the whole idea of the orbis terrarum, that the Christ holds in his hand, or God, it depends on the image, holds in his hand. And then even before the Roman Empire, orbis terrarum, all of these images are sort of coalesce in the idea of the globe and have absolutely nothing to do in the place where we are. It's an argument for empire. It means something about total closure, as Peter Sloterdijk has argued so beautifully. It has no connection with the life we live in. But the second reason why it's so bizarre as an icon of planet and the icon of ecological movement is that, in fact, the idea of nature, which is implied in this image, no longer unify, if you think of it. We are supposed to like it because politically we say, look at the planet, the blue planet, it's so beautiful, it's so round that we are politically unified just by looking at it. And of course, this is what the Whole Earth catalog was doing in the 60s. But look at it. There's nothing more divisive than nature, this planet. Nothing which actually more dividing us than the question of energy, the question of food, the question of transportation, of clothing. Everything is actually, on the contrary, on this planet, a source of controversies and divisions. And of course, the most classic example is that of a climate dispute, pseudo dispute. But of course, that's the problem always with global view, is that the blue planet is supposed to unify, and we never when we look at it, we never capture the fact that it's actually a source of divisions. So I made the suggestion that we should stop using any blue planet on any documents or tract or anything having to do with ecology, at least. Why? Because the sheer view of the image is actually depoliticizing us. And the third reason why it doesn't work is because the global is always grasped locally, even for this very image of a blue planet. Here. You are in Apollo 8. December 1968, 24th. And the history of this image is extraordinary. This is the Earth rise. This is a very famous image. But listen to the noise. It's a very cramped little cabin inside which the astronomers of Apollo 8 are trying to make sense pixel by pixel of what they see. And actually those images have nothing immediate about them. They are, on the contrary, highly transformed by software to be able to capture any sort of shape. But the most extraordinary thing is that this is true of all global views. When you see or when you claim to see something globally, you always see it inside those very tiny little bubbles, which are themselves usually air-conditioned, noisy, small, cramped, and inside which the people who are looking globally, supposedly, have most often very narrow view of the global. But I think it's a general lessons which we have to be careful to draw, which is that the global, which is always associated with this notion of a planet, a blue planet or not, is actually very dangerous because it depoliticizes the complexity of making it and composite bits and pieces at once. And this is why I'm so interested in the causes of our disorientation in space. Because I think that if we are disoriented in space, it's because we are used to this idea, to these fundamental vectors, but we are also disoriented in time. So the disorientation in space is one thing. The disorientation in time is even more, if I can say that, disorienting. You know those images. We have learned them at school. They are sediments. They are studied by this very beautiful science of stratigraphy. And you know how to read them. You start from the bottom, which is always, most of the time, the most ancient. And on the top of it, there is the little earth on which we inhabit and which could be called the landscape. And we know how long it takes to sediment these things. Millions of years, probably, in these images, probably more than 10 or 20 millions. Now, the problem is that recently, stratigrapher, which was not a discipline in the press very much, it's a very solid and serious discipline, but not the one most sexy and exciting. Stratigrapher want now to tell us that this history, this layering, this accumulation of layers, we are part of it, we being a sort of unspecified human race. And there is a disorientation there which is as deep as the disorientation in space. Because I don't think we want to be part of its history. At least we don't want to be part of what they call geohistory. And what they call geohistory is a fusion, if you want, maybe a confusion, of two different regimes of time. One, which is those millions of years and billions of years of sediment. And here we arrive, the little people who were at the surface, at the superficie there, who are supposed, they say, to be part of this history. Not only to be part, but to be one of the most important, today, most important actors in the sedimentation and stratigraphy of those mountains. And there is something here which is completely implausible, if you can say that. I mean, it's something which I have difficulty understanding. It's mind-boggling to be taught by geologists that our history has any sort of relation, any sort of scale in common with this long and immense accumulation of sediments. And it's actually, I think, one of the source of climato-skepticism which is perfectly reasonable. Because how can anyone imagine that there is something which is comparable between the history of unspecified human, this unspecified human appears in what is called the Anthropocene. Anthropocene is a disputed term, there's a whole controversy about it, but it's the term which they use, some of them, stratigraphers use, to compare or to contrast with the 12,000 years before, which they call the Holocene. But what is completely normal in a way, in the skepticism of people reading this report from scientists, geologists, is that there is nothing that scales these things. It's not you, it's not me. I mean, there's something sort of as if the clothes which are given to us, you are the agent of geohistory, was too large for us. And that's a third disorientation. It's a disorientation this time in agency. We are not the one who are supposed to be able to modify the geology of a planet. That doesn't make any sense. So we have to understand why people really don't believe in all the things that is coming from science in a way. How could we? I mean, it's impossible to be disoriented in space, in time, and in agency. But if you look at an article of Science a few years back, Science magazine, the first moment actually when they mentioned the word Anthropocene in a scientific journal, look, it's not the size of the sediment which is striking. This is if you see it, this is in the Arctic, so you have the ice beneath. And as I said before, in my little anecdote of a Munch scream, the ice has melted, and immediately, if you see this little screen with the dotted line, life is back. Immediately life is back. And you have this little green, little layers. Of course, it's minuscule. The layers is minuscule. Nothing like the huge, long kilometers of sediment I've mentioned before in the two other slides. So it's not the size, it's the composition which marks all this idea of the Anthropocene. People are not disputing that even all of the things we have been doing since the Industrial Revolution will be not maybe a centimeter thick. But if you look at the composition, those people, like this committee of the Anthropocene led by our colleague Jan Zalasiewicz, they say, if you look at the composition, at the soot, at the plastics, at the chemical pollution, at the nucleotide, if you make the experiment, the thought experiment, of imagining one of them 10,000 years in the future, if in the future there are still people doing stratigraphy, which is, of course, not sure, but if they do stratigraphy, they say, geologists say, that they would have no difficulty recognize that these minuscule layers mark a geological epoch, not by its size, but by its composition. And they even, Zalasiewicz wrote a whole book on that, they even are more cruel. They say that not only that, they will conclude that the living people who were there on Earth at this period have lived there very little time. So it's actually doubly troubling to make and to read this thought experiment that the stratigraphers oblige us to do. Not only it's very small, it's very radically different, and it means that a civilization is ripe and then gone, which is not a bad description of our possible future. So if we have a disorientation in space, in time, And in agency, it might mean that we need something else. We need to take into account a new scenography. And that's what I'd like to get in now. So let's try to get inside without the mythology, the visual mythology that we associate so often with the view from space and the globe. Let's try to imagine other ways than being always looking at the Earth as a globe, as a planet, in the astronomical sense that we have learned from Galileo and the others. We are supposed to land on something which is, of course, here just an intuition by Alexandra and Sonia, the sort of thing we have to consider. Something which doesn't have the quality, so to speak, of the globe, which precisely that's what we try in this lecture. Another feel, if you want. Another sensitivity where we are inside and we see things laterally. And what is interesting is that this intuition by artists is actually played out very efficiently by scientists who call themselves scientists of a critical zone. And it's this critical zone which I want to devote some time with you now. What is a critical zone? Well, it's the Earth, as you see on the top there, but where we consider not its geology, not its deep Earth center, but only its surface, its pellicule. But it's infinitely small. So small that it's actually invisible when you have a global view. This is a great paradox. When you look at the Earth as a globe, everything which is life, everything which we are concerned by disappears from view, so small it is. Because life is just a biofilm. And what you see here, it is an interesting cut, if you want, a way of you take this, which is here, the small film of life. You are not interested in this, which is the deep Earth geology. You are not interested in this, which would be less, let's say, the space, the infinite universe, precisely the place where you were supposed to see the blue planet when in the image before you were in the view from nowhere. Now you are not in the view from nowhere. You are here on this very small little pellicule. And what you see here is the segment of probably a few kilometers up and down of all the thing we have ever experienced, which is the great paradox of looking at the critical zone. We are not on the blue planet. We are not in infinite space. We are in this little series of small layers. And here, Alexandra has begun to draw all of the instruments which these scientists, who are calling themselves scientists of a critical zone, are trying to invent and put in what they call critical zone observatory, so that they have a better understanding of the dynamics of this very small place. And that's a great paradox. If I show you a globe, or even worse than a globe, a Google map, you say, oh, I know where it is, this is exactly where I live. It has no relation whatsoever with the way you live. If I now show you something like the critical zone where you live, you say, well, I don't understand this image, they are very bizarre, I'm disoriented. That's the problem I try to treat tonight. The image we have to represent where we are the one where we are not. And the image we need to represent where we are, we don't have them. And this is why it justifies this series of experiments in order to understand where we land, because we need to land at some point. We are not going to be outside. And if we want to be inside, to remain inside, we'd better begin to understand where exactly and what is the feeling of the land, so to speak. There's a beautiful word in English, which I forget, the lay of the land. The lay of the land is what we are. And we have no other ground than this one. We have no other ground than this one, which is a great paradox. And we need here to use all sorts of intuitions and scientific imagination to understand where we are. Something which is less homogeneous, with more like a skin, wrinkled, wounded, scars, all sorts of interesting words, craters, borders, notches, dents, rashes. Something which doesn't have at all the ubiquitous and isomorphism of a space in which things are supposed to be put in the traditional view of the Earth actually viewed from the outside. If you begin to see it from inside, it doesn't look at all like... and Sonia has made a little test on that by using photogrammetry. Look, this is a photogrammetry of the soil in which we are made grass. Look the way, I mean, this is what we should be able to effectively capture. The presence of the earth, not viewed from above, but viewed in some sort of sense laterally. Exactly that, viewed from the inside, without any possibility of escaping from it. And that's exactly what many work by artists and scientists should get at, to cure us, if you want, of our obsession from the outside global view from nowhere, which has made us so much indifferent to the question of being on Earth. Photogrammetry is fairly spectacular, but it's also a very unusual view. So again, this is where we are, and this is what we have difficulty in representing and seeing. See, it's a view from laterally. One way of trying to understand this new intuition of the insiderness is to say that we need a new cosmology. Cosmology might be a bit too much, but this is the word that is used in history of science and of course, in science itself to mean how do we represent the connection between the Earth and the Sun. Now, what is interesting here is that this is the result of a work done by 3 different people: a philosopher, myself, an architect, an artist, and a geochemist. The question was asked by the geochemist, a specialist of critical zone. Can you, the philosopher, but especially you, the artist, represent the critical zone in a way that doesn't disappear from view when it is considered? If you put it on the globe, the blue planet, the critical zone disappears. So the solution that Alexandra found, I think it's a beautiful solution, and we published a paper, the 3 of us, is to reverse, like a glove, if you want, to put us really inside. So what she did, this is not the center of the Earth, this is actually where we are, this is the atmosphere. And then the deep Earth is sent, so to speak, is projected outside at the 4 corners of this image, okay? So instead of having the Earth in the middle and the invisible little pellicule here of a critical zone, we did the opposite. What happens? Well, then the whole thickness of a critical zone, and I remind you that everything you ever experience is always inside the critical zone. I mean, we never, all the life forms are there. A few kilometers up, a few kilometers down, but there is nothing else, there is no outside of that. Even if you are in a space station somewhere, like we heard Apollo 8 a minute ago, it's still closely related to Houston or Cape Kennedy. If it were not, it just vanish in space. So everything is there, and the astute of this cosmological representation is to keep the old idea of the circle, but change the meaning of them. Those circles are not the blue planet remnant, so to speak, but geochemical cycles. So the idea is to move from circles to cycles. It's a very simple idea, but it's very radical, and we are slightly destabilized when you see it for the first time. Imagine a merry-go-round. You have one merry-go-round, and then nest several of them at different speed. Very fast in the middle, then slower, and very slow at the extremity. And then imagine that geochemical cycles are continuously moving, changing one merry-go-round and another merry-go-round, if you want, going either very, very quickly, like the oxygen in the middle, and all of the atmospheric gas, very, 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 very slow at the out edge, like quartz, which transforms itself in millions of years. So you take all the elements of a Mendeleev table, you put them in this merry-go-round, and you see what happened to them. This is, of course, the question that the geochemist Jérôme Gaillardet, our co-author, asked Alexandra to solve. Now, what is important here is that you do represent the situation in a very different way than the old idea of the outside and the inside, because there is absolutely no way for you to escape being inside. There is something very strange in this, the model of a globe. You are human, and you look in the infinite space, in this sort of Platonic imagination, and the infinite universe is on top of you, and you could ascend to it. Which is, of course, a completely unrealistic way to represent the way we live. We are inside, and the best we can do is to constantly modify the biochemical cycle in which we are at a par with all the animated entities, animal, viruses, bugs of all sorts, which are in the same sort of circulation and cycles than we are. So it's very important to give, to multiply. Of course, this is just one paper and just one representation, but it's very important to multiply alternative way of representing realistically the inside, because of course this inside is also what has been composed by the life form. And then we can ask a second question, which is what makes the axis, what makes this all merry-go-round work, so to speak, which is, of course, the sun. The sun is the driving force of this mechanism. And this is again an image produced by Alexandra Arène. The sun, and I think this image is amazingly interesting in terms of history of cosmology. I don't exaggerate, I think it's very important. Because it's simultaneously geocentric, the Earth is in the middle, the life forms are there, they are the ones who activate by their 4 billion years of innovation many of this geochemical cycle. But of course, the energy that is coming there is coming from the sun. So the sun is also, it's also heliocentric and geocentric at the same time. But of course, the sun which is there is not an astronomical sun. It's the sun, it's an energetical sun, if you want. And what is interesting in this representation is this idea that the life form have used the sun in order to make them move around. As Deleuze said, it's the living form which makes the sun cause of themselves, which is a beautiful definition of what the life form did. They sort of suck the sun in. So it is a cosmological definition of life on Earth, but there is no outside. Because it's in the middle, it's right here in the middle, that actually everything which we consider like our abode, the atmosphere in which we are, but not the space, the atmosphere, is actually residing. So we are working more and more on those images, trying to find alternative which always points at the insiderness, to try to avoid the facility of the escape, so to speak, the facility of the infinite universe, to which we are, since Plato, always trying to look at. And then the same designer and architect and artist trying to apply this very general view to one specific case, which is to design a sheer landscape in one example, which is, if you want, a park, a wildlife park, you would say, or it's actually a hunting ground, a protected hunting ground, and they have studied it. And they try to offer a representation of all the living forms who are cohabiting in this space, inventing a different type of map and cartography. Imagine that Thoreau in Walden, Thoreau, and in Walden are trying to make a map at the end of Walden of all of the different entities described in his book. Something like that. But of course, it's not an image which is easy to get. So I think we will ask the technical team to see it again and I will name the different entities which are, so they try to represent in the same type of thing, the park rangers, the wild boar, there are fox somewhere there, there are the scientists studying the forest animal, of course, the scientists are part of the living form there, the marten, the owl, the bees, the crows, the hunters, which are part of the story by necessity. I think we are going to see at some point the rivers. Yes, this is the river coming. Another agent, another agency, part of it. The bird watchers, the farmers, the woodworms, the badgers, bats. There are bats, of course, woodpeckers, deer hunting dogs, and so on and so forth. Now, I agree it's not a Michelin's map. It doesn't help, and even if you have a GPS, you cannot get into the space. But remember, that's the whole idea. Google, GPS, Michelin, even though Michelin's map aren't the best in the world, are not made to be understood except by people from the outside. I mean, it's a map precisely because you are not inside. If you are inside, you need other type of map, like all of these autochthonous maps that anthropologists and historians of cartographers study. And that's the whole principle of the autochthonous map, is that it's made precisely to follow the maps and to get some sort of repère, some sort of signpost when you are not trying to be outside, but inside. I don't think we need to see it a third time. But it's beautiful. It's beautiful, and it looks like an autochthonous map, which is very interesting to think that this is done also by when you talk with scientists, trying precisely the scientists of a critical zone, trying to feel their way in this space, which is not space in the traditional sense of the word. So now I can get into the third part of my lectures, which is what's the consequence of those efforts to orient ourselves inside a space which is different. It is not the outside space. And this is where, of course, we enter into a more disturbing part of the lecture. Alexandra tried to give me, for this little political book I've done, Down to Earth, a sort of simplified version of the political situation. Of course, it is a simplified version. I started by saying the globe and the outside and the big view from nowhere is the driving force. And it's, at the beginning, it was not a utopia. We have moved politically, sort of torn in between, torn by this vector between the top, the globe, and the bottom, the local, let's say, to simplify. The whole modernizing movement, so to speak, is to escape, emancipate, get out of the past, get out of the archaic localization, and proceed so that you move. And she found a very funny way to show the difference between this difference from the local to the globe. But the problem, this is where we live now, is that the global has disappeared. I understand that in the US, now globalist has become a curse, so to speak. But it's not false, because for another reason, which is that the globe has disappeared simply because there is no Earth corresponding to that globe. No one can imagine today that we will develop the globe, that we actually realize the horizon, the mythical horizon of the globe, let's say, at the level of development of New York or America for soon 9 billion people. Gone. No one believes that anymore. So what happened? Well, it happened that everywhere people are deciding that then they should go back. They should go back to the locality, to the nation state, to the ethnic belonging, to something they can stick to. If a globe is gone, that is, if a whole drive to modernization is actually seen now as a utopia, it means give us at least back our identity. And identity has become the great term. Or nationalism, which is again a term that is coming very quickly into fashion. So the difficulty is that none of this vector going from the local to the globe and back has any relation with any of the things I've described in the lecture. So if you take local as one attractor and the global as another one, there is a third attractor. And this third attractor is, of course, what I've tried to describe very clumsily as the inside Earth. I don't know how to describe, this is a problem, which is that there is a difficulty in this third attractor, which is the paradox I've mentioned 2 times already. This is where we are. This is where we reside. This is what is made visible by all this invention I talked before. But we don't recognize it as our space. So we are supposed to land in a place, I call it the terrestrial, which is not represented in any sort of public way, in any sort of instituted way. And instead, what we have is the local, which now means the return to the identity, or the global, the globe, which is, in a way, now considered as a utopia. So the whole political tragedy is that many people, millions of people, feel that, in fact, we have to get inside this third attractor. This is where we belong. This is our real space. This is where we are actually grounded. Except all the terms which are associated with grounding, landing, in German Heimat, have been kidnapped precisely by those here, those who want to go back to the local. And all the terms which are people associated with the world, all those terms which are associated with the great virtue of the world and the globes. In French we have two words, monde and global, monde and globe, globalization and mondialization, which is difficult to make the distinction in English. And the point is that it's been kidnapped by the globalizers up there, which again try to be in a space which has no earthly existence. So this is why all this attempt, which I demonstrated before, which might look to you a bit like jeu de l'esprit, are in fact very important to try to accommodate our sight on the terrestrial. If I want to be a bit more precise, I will show you a fourth attractor, which I'm afraid to say you know very well. And it's very funny because the fourth attractor is there, and it's the one, I won't mention his name, but he's President of the United States, and which has invented a very strange solution, but very efficient, and which has been copied everywhere. Probably someday it will be copied in Brazil, which is to simultaneously use the most globalist view possible and the most narrowly nationalistic view possible in one argument. It has no chance to work except if you organize all your politics to deny the question of the terrestrial, meaning in practice, legally and politically and juridically, the question of climate change. So I don't know how to call this little guy up there. Out of the world probably will not be. Basically, people who say, we know the question of the global is gone. We know the return to the local is impossible. What's the consequence? Too bad for you. Sorry, you guys, we are not in the same common world. And of course, technically, it was played out in June last year when your president declared that he will not be part of the climate agreement of Paris, which was, in effect, a declaration of war, very explicitly. We are not, which is very funny. Before, people were saying, in a joke, you don't seem to live on the same planet. But we don't live now, literally, on the same planet. The people who are there say we don't live in the same planet as you. We don't give a fuck about the way you would live. In the United States of America, there is no climate change. In the United States of America, or now soon in Brazil, they would say the question of what happened to the planet is of no interest. Now, there is one good thing about this position, and this represented by the line there, is that it's an exact orientation toward the terrestrial. If you do exactly the opposite of what your president does, then you indicate the direction of a terrestrial. But of course, it's a very strange way of being the most ecological government on Earth. But in a way, it's true. You are the first government who explicitly said the question of climate organized the whole of politics. And all political positions now are somewhere in this very simple-minded diagram. We flee away, and we don't give a damn. We don't live in the same planet. We return to the local, no matter how narrow it is, and no matter how ecologically unsound and unsustainable it is. We abandon and we keep going to the global if it's possible. But in the meantime, which is very puzzling, the terrestrial down there remains still largely unknown. Not unknown because we live in it. Unrepresentable because of a mass of obsessive representation tool we have developed to get out. So it's very puzzling in the Western people interested in the anthropology of modernism like me. It's very puzzling to see the enormous energy which have been used to not being able to represent the situation. And it's true, the situation is difficult to represent. As I've worked a lot on Gaia, Gaia is very difficult to represent. And the situation in which we are politically, the idea that we could have any influence on the Earth system is mind-boggling and is unprecedented. So it's normal that we have difficulty representing our situation. What is not normal is to believe that the more outside, the more emancipated, the more out of the world we would be, the better we would in the end. So I've done my little turn inside, push you inside. And in fact, in some sort of sense, we are discovering very similar to the event in the past, a new world, except it's a new world. It's a different thing. And I was very amused and moved that this is a diagram by our geochemist friend, Jérôme Gaillardet, trying to represent the way he sees a critical zone. So this is a scientific representation by a scientist of all the phenomena he would like to represent if we had the tools to do so. And you look at it, and it's obviously it's the same world in which we are, of course, but it's not exactly the same representation we are used to. It's very difficult to understand how many sciences are simultaneously now trying to get into this critical zone and to invent alternative representation. And the extraordinary amount of connection we'd like to have with the artist and the social science and the anthropologists and the philosophers and so on. Because again, the critical zone where all the life forms, all the animated entities are actually collaborating is very difficult to represent. They are invisible from afar, and all our intellectual tools have been invested into looking things from afar. So what is so interesting in the present situation, the situation is terribly depressing, but what is at the same time so interesting is that we are discovering a new, how can I say that? It's not a new world in the sense that, like it was in the 16th century, when you had to have, at the time of what was called the Great Discovery, with lots of quotation marks, you added a new world to the old, and you largely depopulated the inhabitant first, and then you occupy it. It's not like that. It's not an extension in space, but it is a new world nonetheless. But it's an extension, precisely, that's the whole idea of getting inside. It's an extension in the complexity of what is not a space out there, but a space beneath your feet, not only beneath your feet, but trembling. So I think we are allowed to say that just as the people in the 16th century were so enthusiastic about the and disoriented, both by the incredible horizons of a new world, we are in some sort of sense in the same position, except what we discover is different ways of being in the same world, if you want. And I think this is why the word Renaissance, which is probably too much of a big word, is paradoxically adjusted to the very tragic situation in which we find ourselves today.